Welcome to the HerHealth Podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk, where we empower women and girls to take charge of their health and well-being. Join us as we shine a spotlight on issues affecting women and girls' health and explore ways to create positive change. Get ready to be inspired and empowered as we discuss health, advocacy, and empowerment for women and girls at risk. Please be advised that this podcast may cover sensitive topics such as gendered violence. We understand that these discussions can be difficult to listen to. If you feel uncomfortable or need support, we encourage you to prioritize your well-being. Consider exploring our other podcasts if these topics are triggering for you. Resources can be found in the description.
Hi, and welcome back to the HerHealth Podcast. I'm Alexandria Lazochek, a master's student in community health sciences specializing in public and population health at the University of Calgary. I also work at the Child Studies Lab, where we focus on research that supports children's lifelong developmental health. In today's episode, we're diving into a critical and timely conversation about innovation in the civil society sector and why adapting to change is no longer optional. This episode is adapted from a webinar hosted by Dr. Sarah Yursich, an early career researcher with AVA. Dr. Sarah Yursich also co-leads the AVA Webinar Series alongside her incredible colleagues Andrea and Jason, who were both present for this session. This episode is a must listen for anyone working in community health, social services, or advocacy, and for those ready to reimagine what's possible in systems level change. To learn more, visit avatraining.ca, and don't forget, you can watch the full webinar recording on our YouTube channel. Link is in the description below. Let's get started.
All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Alliance Against Violence and Adversities, or AVA's webinar series. This is what we're calling Webinar Wednesdays because we host a webinar pretty much every Wednesday, and we'll hope that you'll join us for those. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Yursich. With AVA, I'm an early career researcher and lead on the webinar series, along with my colleagues Andrea and Jason, who are here with us today. In my other roles, I am the co-director of the Frida Center for Research on Violence Against Women and Children, and faculty in sociology and criminology at Capilano University. Before we dive into content, I do want to acknowledge that on a national level, we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous people of the land on which they live, work, or visit, and become engaged allies together. We, as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and their rights and responsibilities in culture, language, and the pursuit of wellness. Just a couple procedural notes before we begin. The session is being recorded, so you'll be able to access this at a later date and you'll be able to share it with friends. And throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A function, which you find on the bottom of your screen, to pose questions for our speakers, which we'll make time to discuss with Andrea and with Carrie at near the end of the webinar during the Q&A portion. And without further ado, I'm very excited to bring you here today for a webinar entitled Innovation at the Back of the Bus with our speakers Andrea Silverstone and Carrie McManus from Sagesse Domestic Violence Prevention Society. By way of introduction, and I'll make it brief, Andrea is the CEO of Sagesse, an organization committed to disrupting systems of abuse. She has led the development of innovation programs and policies addressing domestic violence or domestic and sexual abuse, including understudied communities like women of affluence and the 2S LGBTQIA+ community. Her leadership has driven impactful initiatives, including Provincial Collective Impact Project, a primary prevention framework, and advocacy for Clare's Law in Alberta. The co-speaker, Carrie McManus, is the Director of Innovation Programs at Sagesse, where she breaks down barriers and drives change. Her passion for eradicating domestic abuse fuels her innovation approach to developing initiatives that challenge beliefs and empower communities. Under her leadership, Sagesse has expanded to address domestic abuse in rural and remote areas, sex work, and underserved communities. Andrea, Carrie, thank you for joining us today. I'm so excited about your talk and to learn more about your work. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very
Awesome.
much.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm gonna just get myself set up. My computer has decided to have a bit of a fit today. So hopefully this works. Can everybody see the presentation?
Not yet. Now we can.
Okay. Perfect. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. And if you're not here live, for watching this recording later, we're so excited to be here and to be chatting with you today about innovation and disruption and this book we wrote.
So we wrote a book. During COVID, Carrie and I had the experience. The slides are a little bit slow, Carrie. I'm not sure what's going on.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to help that. I'm sorry.
Okay. Anyways, we wrote a book. During COVID, Sagesse had a very interesting experience, which was that as other organizations were struggling to be able to meet the very quickly changing climate that we were in, Sagesse felt very well poised to be able to meet that challenge. And part of it was because for years, Sagesse had been investing in and engaging in innovation in a very deliberate and mindful way. And so over the course of COVID, we had a lot of learnings about our experiences of innovation. And we did a deep dive into a more purposeful way of being able to describe what innovation was in the civil society sector, both for ourselves as well as for our staff and for our sector. And so we wrote a book, but we began writing it during COVID. So this has been a real passion project that has taken us quite a while.
And also means that we have all of these hilarious, funny memories of writing in Andrea's garage, which we set up as an outdoor living room with these crazy industrial heaters that probably we shouldn't have been running in an indoor space, and just being absolutely frozen, but sitting there and working on the book and talking through all of it. So there's lots of interesting memory associated with the content and the theory of this. So if you've read the book or seen the book, or if you've heard Andrea and I speak in our times of being less professional talking about our research, you may have heard the name Candy McStone. And so I guess the question is, Andrea, who is Candy McStone?
Well, Candy McStone is our alter ego. And so if for anyone that can't figure it out, it's Carrie McManus and Andrea Silverstone, and we became Candy McStone. But essentially, Candy McStone is this amazing collaboration that we have created that allows us to engage with curiosity and bravery. And we're going to talk about those values in innovation. And I think it also has allowed us to synergistically grow how we see and how we understand innovation. And we're going to talk a little bit about this later, but we think that a big part of being able to engage in this work is, if not having a cohort of people around you engage in the work with you, at least to have one person who is really supporting you through it, because innovation work is hard. And when I say hard, I don't just mean hard because often you have to fight the status quo, where you have to try and have thought experiments that encourage you to think about things in new and disruptive ways, but it's also hard emotionally. And so to have a partner that you can go through it with makes a very big difference. And so that is who Candy McStone is. And of course, we have to have fun while we're doing it.
So probably lots of you are thinking about, innovation. It's like the big buzzword. People are talking about innovation a lot. I would suggest that people are talking about innovation more now than they were even when we started writing the book. It's become kind of the latest thing. I liken it to when I first started in the sector, we were going through a trauma-informed practice sort of renaissance of everybody was talking about trauma-informed practice. But what did that actually mean, and weren't we already actually doing all of that? And so when I think about innovation, I think about, innovation as a buzzword, innovation as an idea. And how is it different for us? When I think about innovation for us, and what is really the grounding for us, is that innovation is actually about a framework and a mindset in how we do all of our work. So not just an innovative project, an idea that we have, something new that we want to try, or some new research. But innovation is the framework that I use and that we encourage our staff and our teams to use in everything that they do, and every problem that we come up against, in every client conversation that we have this framework of starting from a place of innovation, figuring out how to engage in that sort of mindset of that willingness to fail, and that idea of being able to really connect into the values that drive us, the way that we show up as humans in our work, and how all of that impacts what we do moving forward. And so for me, when I think about innovation and why it's different than the sort of buzz of innovation that happens now and gets talked about often within a framework for the tech sector, I think for me, that's what feels different about this.
Yeah, I think that just to sort of put it in a way that I often think about it is we don't compartmentalize innovation. It's something that is an ingredient that is infused in every bit of work that we do, which also means that we have to be very clear, and we're going to talk about this, of our values that guide us. Because if we don't have clarity in the values that guide us, and we don't have clarity also in the grounding of our why, then I think it's really easy to get lost in the buzz of innovation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is, I think, the first bit of grounding.
I was going to say, this might be my favorite slide of all the slides.
So this is the very first bit of grounding that we actually think needs to happen. It's almost like the pre-existing things that need to be in place in order for innovation to be able to happen. And so the reason we call it the feels UG, and if you read our book, you'll see this is in many ways the hardest chapter that we had to write ourselves, as well as the hardest part of innovation for ourselves. And so innovation is really challenging emotionally. Innovation challenges us to admit sometimes that what we've been doing hasn't been working, no matter how hard we've been trying at it. Innovation, I think, also challenges us to think about scary futures that we might not want to envision or think about. And I think also innovation requires us to be secure in attachment to our organizations, to ourselves, to our communities, because I think if in any way we feel threatened in those attachments or disorganized in those attachments, we stop making decisions based on an openness to wherever innovation is going to lead us, and we start to hold on to things because of emotional responses.
One of the things that we talk about in the book, which is, totally an idea that we have borrowed from many amazing innovators and people around us, which is the idea of the tipping point. And I think, when we talk about tipping points within our work, we often talk about them from the perspective of, what's happening in the environment around us. Some could argue we're living through a tipping point right now in terms of the political climate that we find ourselves in. But what was interesting as we were thinking about this and thinking about how our own emotional journeys are part of this, we were able to really think about what are the tipping points for us personally within this work that allow us to actually be able to sit in innovation, and to be able to embrace all of those things that Andrea was talking about, the sort of the pieces that come around us. And so I share a story in the book about my own personal tipping point of the sort of recognition of what are the pieces that I can bring forward, and then what are the pieces that I actually cannot bring forward, and what does that mean if I actually can't be the person that can solve all of these things, as somebody who thinks I'm super smart and very capable, and what does that do to me, right? What does that tipping point allow for me to be willing to step into? Or if I'm not willing to process that, what does that actually mean in terms of how I then would move forward and present myself and engage with myself?
Yeah, I think that at the end of the day, it's about a lot of consciousness. And I think that also part of the Candy McStone ingredient in the feels is I think that Carrie and I both hold each other accountable to that consciousness, and we also explore that consciousness with each other. One of the conversations we often have is, why do we feel the drive for innovation? What has created in us that experience, and where else in our lives has that echoed and resonated?
Although sometimes instead of saying it from a theoretical place, we say, why? What is wrong with us that we are doing this? That may be just in a moment of burnout. So go
I'll
ahead.
let you start with it, Carrie.
Okay. So why isn't the civil society sector more innovative? So I want to start this. I was looking at LinkedIn this morning, and I was seeing different people posting about different things that they're doing, different initiatives, new ideas, different virtual or text-based platforms that are being used. And so I want to start by saying what part of what we're talking about here is not to say that nobody's doing anything innovative, and aren't we all terrible? There is lots of amazing pockets of innovative work that is happening within the social service sector. And I think that, we have seen that over the years. We have seen that since COVID. And I think we'll continue to see that as we go through this current sort of phase that we happen to be in. But when we think in general about the idea of innovation, the idea of risk taking, the idea of being willing to fail, one of the things that I often think about is I sort of harken back to this idea of the social responsibility that we feel like we have as the civil society sector to prevent harm from happening to the people that we work with, to the communities that we serve, within the lens of our work and how we do that work. And I think that that is a really powerful starting place for the kind of work that we want to be doing, to be really conscious of what is it that we want to do, what are we trying to accomplish, what is the world we're hoping to help to co-create for communities and for individuals. But when our fear of hurting people or causing harm stops us from actually even exploring what harm looks like to the communities that we work with or to the individuals, we start to let our own fears as service providers, as outsiders sometimes to the work that we're doing, as people who have professional designations and have insurance companies, insurance that we have, and have organizations that say you can't do this or you can't do this. Those things start to cloud in to what and how we think about innovation, or what and how we think about the how far can we go in the work that we're doing, because we have all of these things that can very easily kind of hold us back. And I think that in that idea of the holding us back, what often ends up happening is that instead of operating from a practice or a mindset of innovation, we end up operating from a mindset of scarcity. And in scarcity, scarcity can mean we don't have the money to do innovation, or we don't have the money to try new projects. But scarcity is also a mindset of we can't step outside of this thing that we know that we have 100% proof is going to be effective, or that we have 100% proof isn't going to cause harm. Because I actually don't think that we make choices in the civil society sector based off of the idea of 100% effective. I think we make choices based off the idea of 100% won't cause harm, or won't have a level of risk that feels intolerable for us. And I think that scarcity, we were talking before the webinar started, scarcity is like an easy thing to be in. And especially now in our political climate and our funding climate, I find myself stepping into scarcity at moments, in a way that I'm not used to. But I would just want to acknowledge that scarcity is a real thing, and there are ways that it protects us in times where in our sector it's really challenging and it's really hard. But when we operate always from a place of scarcity, it leads us to a place where we aren't looking up and out for innovation. We aren't practicing from that place of what other opportunities are there? How could we look at this different? How could we future plan? But we practice from we just have all of these problems in front of us right now, and we have to solve all of these problems. And once we solve all of these problems, then we can think about looking out externally. And of course, when we put our head down and we solve the problems, every client you serve, there's going to be another client to come in to serve after that. And so it becomes this sort of perpetuated loop of not creating space or the opportunity to look up and to look out.
I think the other thing that we have to be very aware of the limitations of why we struggle in the civil society sector with innovation is the systems that surround us. One of the things that we talk about in the book is Simon Sinek's work around the infinite game. But I think that the systems around us, whether there are funders, whether there are donors, whether there are boards of directors, they are all directing us into a finite game where we have to report on quarterly outcomes, yearly outcomes. And as we know, human beings don't change in that way, and human beings don't evolve and don't have success in those ways. And so, as long as we're being forced into a finite game where we're living in an infinite world, we're going to find ourselves being challenged to being able to innovate because the systems around us aren't going to allow us to engage in that infinite game. And the infinite game also means that it's less static than the finite games. There's ups, there's downs, sometimes there's success, sometimes there's failure. But hopefully with each iteration, we're moving forward to a better solution or a better society. But you need frameworks around you to support that. One of the things I talk about in the book is Sagesse's board of directors. And early on in my career with them, I had a fairly big failure. And I was fairly sure that it was going to lead to me and Sagesse parting ways. And in fact, the board treated it very differently. They treated it as a growth opportunity and an innovation opportunity, which then I think led me to feel safe to engage even more in innovation. But I think many CEOs don't have a system of support from a board of directors or from funders or anyone else around them that actually supports the engagement and innovation.
So Andrea, you bring up a really good topic, which is that how do we actually foster more innovation and a more innovative sector? And I think that, we're going to talk a little bit about some of those technical things that we think are really valuable and really important in doing that, and having a board of directors. For myself, having a CEO that that holds that space. I can remember calling Andrea one day pretty early on in my career, and I had been at a presentation and I had said something that I was pretty sure people weren't going to be super happy about. And I called her and said, just so you know, I just said this thing. And if somebody calls you, I did it. It's me. It was me. And I was really scared to have that conversation with her because I've had previous bosses where I said, I just said this thing and people are mad at me. And he said, well, why did you piss them off? And Andrew said, okay, I got it. And there was just this total different sort of feeling. And so I think, we'll talk a little bit about that. But I think that, fostering a more innovative sector, I think, part of what I think about is getting really, really clear. We've talked about our own personal feels, the UGs, the getting clear about that. I think organizationally and sector wise, we have to be really clear about our mission and our vision. What are we trying to do? Are we trying to help people who are currently being harmed, or are we trying to prevent harm from happening? And I think that, for us, for me in the work that I do, when I started to think about our work differently, when I started to change that of we're not trying to help people who are harmed, we're trying to prevent harm, which part of preventing harm means helping people who are currently harmed so that it prevents future experiences of that, but it also opens up these other opportunities in these other sort of spaces. And I think that, for us, one of the things that we often talk about when we think about sort of fostering a more innovative sector is what does it look like to really think about stepping into fear of failure? What is our risk tolerance for that? How do we define failure and start to create opportunities for exploring that in a way that still doesn't cause harm to people, but in a way that allows us to learn things and to take on new information that then can be used in terms of how we look at and think about and engage within our sector.
So I think we're going to talk throughout this about how to engage and foster a more innovative sector. But I think that one of the things that for me in the book is actually really important are the cast of characters that help you to foster a more innovative sector. One of the things, as Carrie was talking about, that I was thinking about was one of our cast of characters is our worthy rival. Also, that terminology taken from Simon Sinek's work, Haider Hassan, who at the time was the head of the CEO of Immigrant Services Calgary, who did some very radical moves when he moved into the position of the CEO there to try and make it the very best organization for immigrants who are coming into Calgary in the very best way that he could. And I remember going out for coffee with him and him saying to me, in the same way that Carrie said to me, I think some people are going to be angry at me. I think he said, I think some people are going to be angry at me. And I think if you don't have those relationships to be able to sit down and for someone to say, yeah, people are going to be angry at you, but you're doing the right thing. Because I think that we get really, really focused on one particular outcome, which is just making sure that we don't put people in any more danger than they're in, versus sometimes looking at the bigger outcome of how do we stop the danger in the first place.
Absolutely. So, Andrea, why in the book do we talk about values so much?
Well, because we work so hard to create them. So I think that one of the things that
This would be great if we had sound effects, because then I could do like a ching, cymbal crash sound.
Yeah,
That's what I imagined in my head.
So one of the things that we realized early on in this work is that two things. One, we had a set of values that was guiding us, and two, it wasn't articulated. And that if you want everyone to be on the bus with you, having, as we talk about an innovation in the back of the bus, but we want everyone on the bus with us, it's really important to know what the bus is. And essentially the bus is our values. And so it's really important to articulate our values so that we're able to share them with our staff, with our stakeholders, with our clients, with the people that we're trying to support change for, so that we're all on the same page. The other thing is that innovation is a hard decision tree. There's often really hard decisions that you have to make as you go forward, and sometimes really heart-wrenching decisions that you need to make. And I think that when you're able to fall back on your values and use them as the guideline as for what innovation looks like, then I think that it helps you to move faster through innovation. It also helps you to move more cleanly through innovation, although one of our values is trusting in the messiness. Then I think it also helps you to move more collaboratively through innovation. I often think about innovation that's happening in the tech world or in the medical world, and those are innovations that are also sometimes innovations that challenge ethics. And it's always really important for those people that are doing those sort of innovations to have really clear values around their ethics, things like cloning and stem cell research and all of those things. And I think that we have the same obligation and the same imperative to have those same ethics surrounding us. And I think that you could almost interchangeably talk about our values as being our ethical imperatives as we engage in innovation.
And I always like to talk about, when we're talking about values, that, the four that are on the screen are the Sagesse values that we did a co-creation process many years ago with our staff and our teams to figure out what those were. They're not the be all and end all. This isn't about taking our values and saying, well, these are the values that lead us to innovation. It is about figuring out for yourselves, what are your own values that lead you to innovation. Most people may not like a value of trust in the messiness. It is my happy place. It's the thing that makes me the most excited about any of the pieces of work, but it doesn't have to be for everybody. And so it is about really being able to articulate for yourself, what are the values, as Andrea said, what is the sort of ethical rooting of the work that we're doing? Why are we here doing it in the way that we're doing it? And being really clear and foundational on that is going to be really helpful. So let's take a minute and sort of talk, now that we've talked about a bunch of stuff, let's go back and talk about what are some of the sort of definitions, right? So again, innovation has become this buzzword. Everybody's talking about it. It often gets used in reference to the tech sector and tech startups. And so what does it actually mean, right? When we think about and talk about innovation within Sagesse, again, we're talking about this from the perspective of a mindset, not of an activity necessarily. So if you think about innovation from a mindset perspective, really what we're looking at is those sort of new way of doing things. And And the mindset of innovation becomes every problem that you look at provides the opportunity to say, is this the best way that we could be doing this? Or are we doing this way because we've always done it this way? And therefore, we've just never stopped to think that actually we have 5 steps in between, and we could actually just have 1 step. Right. And so the mindset of looking at new ways of doing things and of improving the current things that we're doing. So when we talk about innovation at Sagesse, we talk about different levels of innovation. Not all innovation is going to lead to the thing that figures out for us how to crack the nut of eradicating domestic abuse. Some innovation is going to make it so that our admin team takes 2 steps as opposed to 7 steps. That's great. All of those innovations have space and value. And when you think about it from a mindset perspective, as opposed to from a project's perspective or an activity perspective, then you start to see that actually we're not trying to quantify innovation. We're actually just trying to have it as a normal part of how we engage and how we operate. The other thing that we talk. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say the other thing that we talk about often that I think in some ways goes hand in hand with innovation. It doesn't necessarily, but I think it's in some ways it does, is this idea of disruption. And so I can remember when Sagesse was going through our name change many, many years ago, and we were figuring out, how do we actually articulate the thing that is who we are and what we do and what we believe. And one of the things that came up, I remember we came up across this word of disruption. And I said to our comms person at the time, I want to use disruption here. And I know you're going to tell me I can't, but I need you to find another word that sort of talks about this in the same way of this like idea of radical change. And she said, no, I'm okay with it. And I still feel floored, obviously, to this day, because I remember that one unique conversation. But I think that when I think about, when we think about innovation and we say it's a mindset, it's not an activity, the disruption is for us part of the driver of some of those pieces of innovation for us, which is the ability to look at what is the thing that we're trying to achieve. And if we stay on this path, does that actually get us there? Or if we're planning for this different future, do we actually have to do radical change in order to come to this new future that we want to be in and that we want to be looking at?
Just to give everyone an idea of the difference between innovation and disruption, and you'll notice the example also on the previous slide. So if you think about, we came to a realization, and the realization was that, and the realization came about because of a publication from Stats Canada that said most people who experience domestic abuse, in fact, only about 35% of people who experience domestic abuse go to social service agencies or social service supports. So our question became, well, where are the other 65% of the people going? And so our innovation response to that was, we probably need to connect people to the supports that they usually go to, which is not formal supports. But our disruption is how do we actually focus on, how do we recognize that we have an entire system that is entirely built around people talking to social supports in order to get help with domestic violence. And actually, the whole system and sector has been built in a way that probably doesn't actually meet the need of the population. And so innovation is, I think, the first bit of the realization and saying, okay, how can we tweak this? Whereas disruption is saying, what's a systemic approach here where we can shift everything to actually make it align with the information that we now have or the research that we now have.
And so for us, when we think about why do that, like why choose to engage in that within our organization, I think that, there's all of these sort of little reasons, right? It allows us to be really, really relevant in the work that we're doing. If we're thinking about this always from this perspective of what do we know, what do we hear, and how does that then change or impact the way that we work? It helps us to, differentiate ourselves from others. It helps us to grow as an organization. It absolutely supports our resilience. And Andrea, started by talking about our experiences of COVID and how our organization was able to be resilient so quickly and so thoroughly because of this sort of this backbone that we have. And we believe, and this is our belief, you don't have to agree, but we believe that disruption and innovation is the only way to really tackle these intractable problems. I often look at this and think, we're 40 years in to solving a problem, and we've figured things out. Absolutely, we've made impact. We've positively impacted people who are experiencing domestic abuse. We've positively impacted communities. Absolutely. But we haven't figured out how to solve this issue yet. We've been looking at the existing playbook, the existing idea of what this is, and we haven't cracked that nut yet. And so for me, I think disruption is the way to be able to get there and to be able to do that.
So in 2016, the board of directors of Sagesse decided that we should stop having innovation as something off the side of a bunch of people's desks and have it as a dedicated activity. And part of it being a dedicated activity meant dedicating funding towards it. And I know that 2 to 4% of an annual budget sounds small, but it's as your budget grows, the innovation budget grows. And at the time, 2 to 4% of our budget was about $40,000. $40,000 to be able to just play around with innovation meant that all of a sudden we could do something we never did before, was research in a way that actually connected us to emerging knowledge, not research that was coming out, with all due respect to all of the academics in the room and to myself, as well as someone who's doing my PhD, research that comes out, sometimes years after the research has been finished because it's finally made its way to a peer-reviewed journal. And so what we actually were able to do with some of that funding was to go to jurisdictions in the world that were doing really innovative work and facing those irretractable issues in ways that no one had ever faced them before. And since we have dedicated about 2 to 4% of our annual budget to innovation, our budget has actually grown by 35%. So it's actually an amazing return on our investment. And the other thing that I would say is that our innovation agenda has actually as well helped us to retain staff that we might not have otherwise been able to retain, which has also led us as an organization, I think, to have a healthier culture and a lower turnover rate. And so I think that there's a lot of benefits to that financial investment, but I think that you need a very visionary board of directors who's willing to say, we're raising undesignated dollars for innovation, because so often what we're trying to do, and this goes back to why the civil society sector struggles so much with innovation, is we're often just trying to raise undesignated dollars to fill holes in the budget to deal with the influx of clients that are walking through our doors, or to top off salaries that are often underfunded. And we want to make sure that our staff are being paid in equitable ways. And so I think it was a very brave decision, but I think it was a decision that actually led us to all of the growth that we wanted, both around dealing with the issue and addressing the issue of domestic and sexual violence and sexual exploitation, but also creating a stronger and healthier HR culture in our organization.
So what are some of the ways that innovation actually shows up at Sagesse and that we actually practice in it and talk about it? So I've talked about this already in terms of the idea of mindset. And we are guided in this work by the work of Carol Dweck in her book around mindset and growth mindset, and really thinking about, if we engage in innovation, if we have an innovation mindset and approach the work that we do from that perspective, then it really shifts and changes how we think about and talk about and experience failure within the organization. It shifts us from saying, oh my God, I tried this thing and I failed, and therefore I'm going to put the whole thing on the shelf, or I'm going to be in trouble, or I'm going to have caused harm, to thinking about, okay, well, how do we do this better next time? What do we learn from this experience that we might label failure? What do we take from that? What do we learn from that? And then how do we incorporate that learning into the new activity or the new idea moving forward? One of the things that I often talk about with our staff team as we do research projects, both informal and formal research projects, is that sometimes the only outcome that we're looking for in a research project is learning. And I think it's really valuable to start when we start our project by talking about that, right? What are the outcomes? Well, the outcomes might be that we want to know if this thing is successful or not, but the outcome also is I want information. I don't care if it's not successful. I care to know why it's not successful. What did we think we knew that actually we were incorrect about so that we can take that knowledge, learn more if we need to, fill in more gaps, and then try again the next time, starting from 15 paces ahead because we've learned all of this new information. And so when you think about that kind of perspective, it's really, really powerful, not just for Andrea and I to have those perspectives within the work that we do and how we approach our engagement with communities and research and all of that. But we sit in a place of privilege. And so in some ways, it's really easy for Andrea and I to have that perspective. But it's really, really powerful and really important for my frontline staff to have that perspective. That when they're doing things, when they say, I have this new idea of how I want to support volunteers, we say, great, what do we want to learn from that? How are we going to engage in that? And then when we try it and say we try holding a wellness event and no volunteers show up, that instead of the staff feeling like, well, I failed because we did this whole thing and nobody wanted to do it, we say, okay, well, what did we learn? We learned that actually volunteers don't want to come to a thing on a Tuesday night. They'd rather something else. And then we take that knowledge and we move it into the next thing that we do and the next thing that we do. So part of how we see this and how we engage in this within our work at Sagesse is we sort of break it into three kind of core columns here. So our idea of how do we grow and engage a resilient culture. Organizational culture is super, super valuable and super important to us. How do we use that to be able to ensure that our staff are getting the things that they need? And so we've built these tools internally in terms of how we check in on the culture of the organization. We have culture mapping that each of our teams do where they talk about what does it mean? How do we show up in failure? How do we know that? How do we have psychological safety so that we know that we can do that? How do we allow ourselves to move fast? How do we know when we're moving too fast? And how do we know when we're moving too slow? We also talk a lot about the sort of capacity and transmitting of values. So again, we have these sort of core books that we talk about within the organization that have really grounded a lot of our work. We talk about this in the book. We're currently running a pilot within the org around these 4 sort of idea statements that are kind of taking from all of the different books and podcasts and different conversations we've had and distilling down to say, actually, we have kind of these 4 things that are really core to us. One of them being, we're a developmental organization that believes in building the plane as we fly it. And so that's an easy thing to say, but what does that actually mean? And so we spend time with our staff actually workshopping through what does that look like? What does that feel like? What does it actually feel like when you realize that you're in a plane and you don't have any wings and you need to try to do something that you require wings for? And so it's helpful because I think it gives space for the staff to talk about what their experience is of that. And to be able to say, sometimes this is really hard. And for us to say, yeah, of course it is. Let's hold space for that. And again, that goes to the culture piece and that psychological safety. And then all of that is really grounded in a feedback informed culture. And we take feedback informed from our clinical tools and our clinical work that we do, and the clinical model built by Scott Miller and Barry Duncan. But when I think about feedback informed, we think about it in terms of the whole of the organization, right? If we try things and it's not working, we need to know so that we can make shifts and adjustments to that. The greatest sign, the theory behind feedback informed, the treatment model is that the greatest sign of success between a client and a clinician is their ability to give and receive feedback. And I think about that in terms of our staff as well, that the greatest sign of success is our ability to give and receive feedback and for that feedback to be acted on. So if somebody says to me, actually, this is really important that we show up in this way at this time, that I listen to that and respond to that, and not say, okay, great, and then pretend like it never happened and kind of just move on.
So one of the things that we really struggled with at Sagesse was how do we make sure that we infuse the value of innovation and also give permission for innovation at every level of our organization and every part of our organization. And one of the ways that we realized that we could really engage in it was from the work of McKinsey and Company around moving fast. And so there are these parts of moving fast through innovation that need to be in place for all levels of the organization. And so we started to change our structure of our organization during COVID in order to be able to be an organization that moved fast through innovation and also encouraged everyone to feel that they had not just the permission to engage in innovation, but also the obligation and accountability to engage in innovation. And so what that looked like for us was a few things. The first was rethinking the ways of working. And so part of what we did is we delegated decision making. And so decision making as much as possible lies with the person that is as closest to the decision as possible and as closest to the event that they need to make a decision about as possible. So if there's a frontline change on an intake form that needs to be innovated or a programmatic change that needs to be looked at, I'm not the one that's making the decision. It's the frontline staff who is as close to that decision as possible that's making that. The other thing is that we tried as much as possible to build as much capacity as possible within our staff so that they have execution excellence, that they know what it looks like to actually be able to look at a decision, realize that a decision needs to be made, and then knows how to implement those changes that the decision leads to. And then the other part is we talk about extraordinary partnerships. And I think that this goes back to the work of Simon Sinek and Worthy Rivals, because those extraordinary partnerships are partnerships both amongst our staff, but also partnerships in our sector. And I think that they're both extraordinary partnerships that push us to be better than we are. I always think about my son who had a good friend when he was in school, and the two of them always competed for the best grade. That was a worthy rival relationship in which they were very close. They motivated each other, they cheered each other on, but they also encouraged each other to excellence. And so I think that those are what extraordinary partnerships are. And I also think we have to think about extraordinary partnerships as extraordinary, outside of the ordinary. Sometimes you need to partner with someone that you didn't imagine that you should be partnering with in order to get the work done. The second thing that we did was we reimagined the structure. And so part of what we tried to do, as I talked about, was to flatten the decision-making structure. We also put a lot of responsibility and accountability and decision-making opportunities within each of our teams who are as close to the work as possible. And we engaged in what our operations director calls radical hybrid work. And so what that meant is that we really let people figure out where the best location for them to be to get their work done was. That work is is an activity and a mindset, not a location, and to engage in that. And that actually, I think, also allowed us to become more successful as a provincial organization. And I think also allowed us to do what we recently did, which was to expand into Saskatchewan. And the last is we talked about reshaping talent. And what reshaping talent means is recognizing leadership and leadership opportunities at every part of our organization. And also to rethink, what does leadership mean? I am in leadership of the organization, and that I hold a lot of accountability for a lot of things around due diligence and financial things and risk management, but I'm probably not the clinical leader because I don't know most about those pieces of work. And I'm not the business services leader because I don't know most about those pieces of work. And so I think it's about really making space for leadership at every part of your organization. And then the last is, there's a great quote, and I'm going to get it wrong, but it's something about how the future is going to be, by Eric Hoffer, the future is going to be held by people who know how to learn, not the learned. And so how do we teach people how to learn, not to rely on what they learned?
One of the other things that we often talk about at Sagesse, and that I think has been really impactful in our innovation, our ability to actually engage in innovative work and to have this both as a framework and as a decision-making tool, is that pulling from the work of Malcolm Gladwell and the idea of thin slicing. So taking all of the knowledge, the expertise, the capacity that we have and being able to make decisions with that sort of thin sliver of information, recognizing that we could get way, way, way more information. And maybe at some point we will fill in some of those gaps. But that if we trust in our ability to sort of balance in this intrinsic thinking, this deliberative work, we can allow ourselves actually, I think it goes to the moving fast piece that Andrea was just talking about. And it allows us to step into things possibly earlier than we would if we were working from a more sort of traditional design or research perspective. And so when I think about thin slicing, I often think about what happened for us at the beginning of COVID. As Andrea mentioned, we moved very, very quickly. And we moved so quickly, in fact, that I said to the team on the first day of COVID, you have a week to figure out how to deliver programs online and go figure it out. Come back to me in a week. We're going to talk about this within 2 weeks. I want us to be delivering programs online. And because of our innovation mindset, because our staff were prepared for that, they were able to do that. And so we took everything that we knew and we distilled it down and we said, okay, I think we have enough of a framework that we can try this. And so from a thin slicing perspective, we didn't have all of the information. We knew we didn't have all of the information, but we had enough to be able to step over the line and to start that out. And then as we went, we absolutely learned things, but we had enough to know that we could do this without causing harm. And that the only way we were going to find out more information was to wait for somebody else to do it and to tell us, or to do it ourselves and to learn the things as we went, which I think feels like an uncomfortable sort of idea or place to be in, but for us has been really, really foundational. And one of the things that I often think about also when I think about thin slicing and Malcolm Gladwell is that, you know, he's revisited this work recently and said, here are all of the things that I got wrong. And here's all of the things that I have learned. And so I appreciate that as an innovative thinker, the ability to also come back and say, sometimes I don't get all of these things right. And here's what I've put out that I would actually say differently now, which I think is really valuable and I think really important to be thinking about in terms of that work. One of the other things that we talk about at Sagesse often when we're talking about innovation and we're talking about, you know, comes out of thin slicing, I think, is our ability to look at how do we engage in work that has a distinction from evidence informed or best practice, right? How do we look at the work that we do? And I often feel like for myself, so much of my work is about this balanced line between what is it that research tells us, what is it that we know, how do we pull from all of the historical knowledge capacity, all of the work of amazing researchers. Many of you are, you know, are on the call. I see lots of names of people that I have worked with before who are doing amazing research. How do we look at that? But also, how do we look at what is the best new innovative practice? What is the things that we actually don't have peer-reviewed evidence about, but we actually are seeing these results that are happening in community. We're seeing this forward progress and research perspective versus our sort of best practice model, which often is backwards looking and takes, you know, so much time and so much money and energy that it restricts and it removes people from being able to engage in that practice of best practice research. And what does it mean then within our organization to be somebody who can do both, who can engage both as researchers ourselves, who can engage in both evidence-informed and best practice research, but also as people who do design and who come up with new programs and initiatives and way of engaging in communities. How do we inform ourselves within both of those spaces and utilize both of those opportunities and categories for information in the work that we do, and how do we encourage funders to be more open to that as a possibility and as an opportunity, so that we're not being limited by these are the things that have been published versus these are the things that actually are happening in community and are really effective and really grounding.
I think that often where this work leads us is to the minimum viable product, which is a terrifying word in our sector. The R&D departments in for-profit organizations often talk about a minimum viable product. And it means that we're trying to experiment and see if what we have is the right thing so that we can iterate to get to the right thing. And I think often there's this perception in our sector that the minimum viable product is going to harm human beings and that we're going to put them in danger. And I think that we have to be able to move away from that and to recognize that our minimum viable product actually comes from a lot of knowledge that we already have and also comes from thin slicing. And unless we engage in a lean experimentation process, we're never going to be able to get to an evolution of where we want to get to really begin to solve and address those irretractable problems.
Yeah, and I think that if we think about it from this sort of perspective of what does it mean to show up in that place, all of these things that we've talked about in terms of feedback, in terms of thin slicing, moving fast, it all comes together and has to be incorporated all together. It can't, I can't just thin slice a bunch of things and then be like, oh, I figured it out. Now we're going to go and that's what we're going to do, and not be open to the feedback of you made this decision and actually it's the wrong thing. It's not working. It's not what people want or need in community, right? We can't decide that we're going to move fast and be really purposeful in that forward movement as an organization if we're not also willing to look at what is the research that comes behind and why are things designed in the way that they are, that helps us to then step into what that next step and those next conversations could look like or should look like. And so for me, all of this kind of comes together into this experimentation process. And again, if we think about innovation as that mindset, if we go in with that capacity to sit in whatever those values are, for us, some of those values, like I said before, for me, one of those values is trusting in the messiness. If I engage in it from that place and that understanding of what it looks like and feels like for me as a human, and therefore also understand that my team, that the people that I'm working with are also going to have their own experience of that, their own human experience of that, so I can hold space for that. And hold opportunity to process through and engage in that, then it allows us to start to just make shifts in terms of how we engage, what we do, how we think about the issues that we're trying to solve, and what is the future space that we're trying to create within our work. And that brings us to our space and opportunity for questions.
Thank you both so much for such a wonderful presentation.
Thanks for joining us on the HerHealth Podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk. Remember, your health matters, and together we can make a difference. Until next time, remember to prioritize your health and well-being. For more resources and support on issues affecting girls, women, and gender-diverse people, visit our website at avatraining.ca. This is Dr. Nicole Letourneau. Thank you for listening.